Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
I'm going to be honest with you because I don't have the energy to dress this up or make it sound prettier than it was, and maybe that's what finally pushed me over the edge. The exhaustion of pretending everything is fine when the same old script keeps playing. The one where my dad nods at my brother like he's just returned from saving the family name, and I'm supposed to clap along and be grateful that I was invited to the show at all. So when we sat down for his birthday dinner and everyone settled into their usual roles, my mother smoothing over tension before it could form, my aunt whispering about property values and which cousin married too fast, my brother Mark flashing that easy grin that has always opened doors for him. I already knew how the night was supposed to go, except this time I was done being the background music to a celebration I'd been told was about family when the fine print always read family, as defined by applause for Mark. You know how some moments don't feel like a big decision when they're happening, more like a tired body finally leaning on a railing that's always been there, and then you hear the click, the sound of something locking into place. And you realize you're not going to pretend anymore. That was me watching my dad stand up with his glass, and before he even spoke I could tell the tone he was going to use, that proud, careful voice he saves for moments when he wants everyone to feel the weight of his words, because he loves performance, not theater with costumes and bright lights, more like a family production where he plays the role of patriarch who rewards loyalty and punishes disobedience, and there I was. The daughter who never mastered the art of laughing at jokes that were never funny to me in the first place. He lifted his glass, looked straight at Mark, and he said, "To the child who truly honors this family," and people did what they always do. They made those grateful noises that are not quite laughs and not quite claps. The sound that fills the space when everyone wants approval from the man at the head of the table, and I felt something roll through me that wasn't rage. Not the kind that makes you slam doors or throw plates. More like a quiet certainty that the story had gone on long enough and it was time to stop at mid-sentence, because I had spent years collecting the parts he never wanted to see, not because I am cruel or vindictive, but because I learned that if you ignore the accounts long enough the numbers still add up. And if you ignore the patterns long enough the pattern still becomes a map, and I had a map. I didn't plan a dramatic speech and I didn't need a build-up, because when you're the one who has had to stitch yourself together after every small cut, you learn the cleanest moves are the quiet ones, so I pushed my chair back, felt a dozen eyes try to make sense of what I was doing, and I walked over to my dad with a single sheet of paper that had lived in my bag for longer than I'm proud to admit. A document I had checked and rechecked, because if you are going to confront the king in his favorite room, you'd better be sure the blade you're carrying is sharp and your hand is steady. Mark smirked, of course he did, because the idea that I would interrupt a moment like that probably felt to him like a bad sitcom twist, the annoying sibling needing attention, and I almost laughed at how predictable he is. Because the only reason people like him survive as long as they do is that other people keep handing them cushions to land on, but not tonight. Not after years of being told that the smart move is to let it go, to stay in my lane, to respect the order of things. As if respect is the same as silence and silence is the same as love. I put the paper on the table in front of my dad, right next to his plate, not on top of it, not like a challenge to a duel, just close enough that he would have to move either the paper or the glass to keep going. And I leaned in so only he and the people closest could hear me, which, to be fair, quickly became everyone, because a family like ours has ears that stretch across a room when something interesting is finally happening, and I said, as calm as I could manage, that he might want to read this first, and I watched the confidence drain from his face not because he had read anything yet, but because he recognized that tone from his own business life, the tone people use when they have facts that don't care about feelings. He tried to smile in that way you do when you think you can turn a moment with charm, but his hand hovered over the paper like it might burn him, and I realized he was already bargaining with himself, already talking himself into the idea that this is nothing, that I'm just being dramatic, that I am, yet again, the daughter with a chip on her shoulder who needs to be taught her place, and it made me strangely calm, because once you see the pattern you can no longer be trapped by it, and I was done being trapped. Someone, I think it was my aunt, made a nervous joke about surprises, and my mother reached for my arm like she could pull me back into the safe lane where I have always been parked, and I gently moved away because this was not a traffic merge. This was a stop sign for a man who ignored every signal that did not flatter him, and yes, I was shaking. Not from fear, but from the clarity of knowing that sometimes the only way to end a story is to write the last sentence yourself, even if your pen is trembling. My dad looked at Mark again, then back at me, and he lowered himself into his chair like he needed the ground to be closer, and I felt the room tilt toward the paper the way people lean toward a rumor they secretly hope is true. Not out of kindness, but out of hunger for something real, and I thought of every time I'd been told I was too sensitive, too direct, too unwilling to play the game, and I decided I was not going to apologize for any of it. Because the only reason I had this page at all is that I paid attention when everyone told me not to. He picked it up, and I said, "You might want to read this first." If you've ever grown up in a family where one kid is treated like a walking investment and the other is treated like a nice-to-have accessory, you already know that resentment doesn't arrive with fireworks or big speeches. It builds the way interest builds on a credit card you thought you'd paid off. Tiny charges that seem harmless until you open the statement and realize the balance has grown while everyone kept smiling, and that's exactly how it felt being my father's daughter while Mark soaked up the attention. Because it wasn't just the obvious things like bigger praise or louder introductions. It was the way decisions were made around him as if gravity lived in his pockets, the way opportunities looked for his name first, and the way I was always invited to help but never to lead, which teaches you, very slowly, that being useful isn't the same as being valued and that you can either keep auditioning for a role you will never get or you can write something else entirely and make them come to you for once. I learned that lesson in quiet places, like when my dad called me late on a Sunday to ask if I could proofread a letter Mark had drafted to a vendor after screwing up an order. And the tone in his voice made it clear this was not a request so much as a family duty, and I did it, of course I did, because we're taught to show up and be dependable. But when the vendor replied the next morning with relief and thanks, my dad forwarded the message only to Mark with a proud note about how quickly he got it cleaned up, and I sat there staring at the screen feeling that familiar heat of being erased while at the same time understanding something important, which is that credit is a currency in our family, and it is spent on the son even when the daughter earns it. And you can either keep subsidizing that economy or you can change the rules of the market. Changing the rules didn't mean yelling, because yelling never landed in this house unless it came from my father's side of the table. So I started doing something that looked like compliance, but wasn't. I started keeping copies. I started documenting. I started making little folders with dates and summaries and email chains where Mark asked me to polish something or make it sound official or fix the numbers so they line up. And every time I hit save, I told myself I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I was just protecting myself from the next rewrite of history where I would inevitably be told that I remembered it wrong. And if that sounds cold or calculating, then you've probably never had to argue with a man who thinks facts are flexible if he repeats himself with enough confidence. It wasn't only the office stuff either. It was every holiday where the seating chart told you exactly where you stood, every joke about me being too serious, and Mark being unnatural. Every conversation where my dad used my achievements as an example of good work ethic, but made sure the spotlight returned to Mark when it was time to talk about leadership. And I'll admit there were moments when I tried to win the old-fashioned way. By outperforming, by thinking if I could just bring in something undeniable, then maybe I'd be invited into the circle. But the line kept moving, the target kept shifting, and one night after a fundraiser where my father introduced Mark to a donor as the future, he slipped me a look like I should be proud of how supportive I was, and something inside me finally clicked, because I realized I didn't need an invitation to a room that relied on me staying on the outside to keep its furniture arranged just so. So I made a decision that looked to everyone like patience, but was really strategy, and it started with boundaries that seem small unless you've lived without them. Like when Mark texted asking me to review a contract 15 minutes before a meeting, and I replied that I wouldn't be able to look at it without a clear request in writing and a reasonable timeline, and he fired back some lazy insult about me being difficult. And I let it sit, no apology, no emergency rescue, no invisible labor to save him from consequences. And you know what happened. The meeting went badly. My father scolded him behind closed doors. And 2 days later, a banker emailed me by mistake because Mark had tried to authorize a draw on a line of credit using language I had written months earlier. The language that required dual sign-off for any transfer above a certain threshold. A safeguard I'd recommended when I was still trying to be helpful and professional, and reading that email, I felt a small rush of something that wasn't joy and wasn't revenge either, more like the calm of realizing that I had quietly placed a guardrail where they never expected it because they never thought I'd be the one driving. Once I understood that I could build things that forced accountability without asking permission, I started doing it everywhere I had a fingerprint. Tiny rewires that didn't look like rebellion. Like creating a shared inbox rule that sent all past due notices to my father as well as to Mark, which meant the first time a supplier pinged about a missed payment, the alert did not die in Mark's archive, but landed squarely in my father's morning scan. And I knew it worked because he called me with that clipped tone he saves for serious matters and asked, very carefully, why he was seeing those notices now, and I said, as plainly as I could, that transparency helps everyone, and then I shut up. Because sometimes the strongest move is letting silence do the math. If you're wondering whether I ever felt guilty, yes, of course, because we're trained to feel guilty for wanting fairness, especially when fairness causes discomfort for people who are used to being comfortable. And there were nights when I stared at the ceiling asking myself if I was becoming hard or petty, and then I'd remember the constant edits to my own story, the endless requests to save face for men who never saved mine. And the guilt would ease into a steadier feeling, which is the belief that accountability is not cruelty, it's respect for the truth we've all been ignoring. The day I knew I had leverage wasn't the day I found something shocking. It was the day I recognized a pattern of carelessness that repeated in emails, in invoices, in small transfer requests that didn't match the attached spreadsheets. And because I am not reckless, I verified every piece. I asked quiet questions. I cross-checked with public records and vendor statements. Not because I wanted to play cop, but because I refused to walk into any confrontation with anything less than certainty. And by the time the picture was complete, I didn't need a confession from Mark. I had the kind of proof that doesn't argue back. And I put it in a folder and told myself I would only use it if he or my father pushed me into a corner where silence would make me complicit. I did one more thing, small but decisive, and it was as much for my sanity as it was for the principle. I emailed the vendor who had been strung along by Mark's delays, and I copied my father on the message, thanking the vendor for their patience and asking them to send all future invoices to a centralized address we all shared so nothing got lost again, which sounds boring until you realize what it did. It cut off the private loop that let Mark hide his mess. It brought sunlight to the one place my father actually looks, and when the first corrected invoice arrived with fees that could not be waved away by charm, my father called a meeting and Mark looked at me like I had betrayed him, but I was done playing the loyal sister who cleans up quietly. Because transparency was my first revenge, and it landed without a single raised voice, and when I walked out of that meeting I knew I didn't need to win my father's love to survive here. I just needed to win the game, and the next move was already sitting in my bag waiting for the right toast. When I tell you I didn't go looking for dirt on my brother, I mean it in the truest way, because I never started out with some grand plan to collect evidence and keep it like a weapon in my back pocket. But life has this way of throwing you into situations where patterns start forming right in front of you, and if you're smart enough to connect the dots, you end up with a picture you can't unsee, and that's exactly what happened to me, not in a single shocking moment, but over a series of small, avoidable mistakes that Mark made because he believed he was untouchable, and over time those mistakes began to overlap and pile up until I realized I was standing on top of something solid. Something that could actually shift the balance in a family where the balance had always been fixed in his favor. It started with a vendor issue that should have been routine, one of those logistical hiccups that any competent person would have handled with a quick phone call and a signed check, but instead, Mark let it drag on for weeks, sending vague promises and blaming processing delays that I knew weren't real because I had access to the accounts and could see the funds sitting there untouched. I didn't think much of it at first, chalked it up to his usual laziness, but then I noticed the same pattern with another vendor and another, until I realized he wasn't just slow, he was hiding something. And when I asked directly, not accusing, just curious, he brushed me off with that condescending smirk he's perfected over the years, the one that says, "You wouldn't understand." That was when I quietly decided I would understand, whether he liked it or not. I started keeping a separate record, not the official ones everyone could see, but my own detailed log with dates, amounts, and every excuse he used. I pulled bank statements that matched against invoices, highlighted discrepancies, and stored email threads where he agreed to pay and then failed to follow through. And before you assume I'm the kind of person who thrives on confrontation, let me be clear. I did this in silence, no warnings, no ultimatums, because I knew if I tipped him off too soon, he'd scramble to cover his tracks, and I wanted to see how deep this went without interference. It wasn't long before I found transfers that didn't make sense, small enough to fly under most people's radar, but frequent enough to catch mine. Money moving in and out of side accounts, labeled with generic descriptions that could have meant anything but, in reality, meant something very specific. That's when I started cross-referencing those transfers with personal expenses I knew Mark couldn't afford without dipping into company funds. Trips that appeared out of nowhere. Upgrades to his house that were clearly outside his official salary. Expensive dinners at places he didn't even like unless he was trying to impress someone. And still, I said nothing, because the more I uncovered, the more I understood that rushing this would be a waste. Leverage is only as powerful as the timing of its release, and I wasn't going to spend it on a minor win. I even tested the waters once, casually mentioning in a group meeting that I'd noticed some discrepancies in the vendor accounts. My father barely looked up, muttered something about not making mountains out of molehills, and quickly pivoted back to praising Mark for landing a big client, a client I knew had been passed to him through one of my contacts, though, of course, that part was never acknowledged. In that moment, I knew that if I wanted any shot at being heard, it couldn't come from vague warnings or half-baked accusations. It had to be undeniable. The real turning point came when a supplier I'd always gotten along with called me directly, saying they didn't know what was going on with the account, but they'd been getting the runaround for months and were now considering pulling out of the deal entirely. They were polite but frustrated, and I could hear in their voice that they were testing me, trying to figure out if I was part of the problem or the one person who might actually do something. That conversation lit a fuse. I pulled every statement from the past year, traced every cent that left our accounts, and matched it to where it was supposed to go. The result was worse than I expected. The gaps weren't accidents. They were deliberate, calculated in a way that only made sense if Mark had been quietly using company money to keep up appearances in his personal life. I compiled it all into one document, not a messy pile of accusations, but a clean, chronological breakdown with attachments, screenshots, and cross-references. I made sure every number was correct, every source was verifiable, and that if anyone looked at it, they would see there was no room for misunderstanding. And once it was done, I didn't immediately run to my father or wave it around like a trophy. I tucked it away in a folder and backed it up in 3 different places. Then I waited. Why wait? Because if I've learned anything from years of being the person in the background, it's that timing is everything. People will ignore the truth if it's inconvenient to hear it. But if you drop it in the middle of a moment they've chosen for themselves, a moment they've set up to reinforce their own narrative, the impact doubles, maybe triples. And my father's birthday dinner was the perfect stage. He had orchestrated it, filled the room with people who would hang on his words, and set himself up to deliver yet another speech about family honor and loyalty. He thought he was untouchable in that moment. And that's exactly when you make your move. I wasn't planning to humiliate him. I wasn't even planning to humiliate Mark. What I wanted was a shift, a crack in the unshakable belief that I would always stand there quietly while they rewrote the story to suit themselves. And with that paper in my bag, the one that could turn their version of events into dust, I knew I finally had the means to make that happen. All I had to do was wait for the right toast, the right sentence, and the right silence to follow. And when it came, I would be ready. The moment my father's eyes dropped to that sheet of paper, the noise in the room seemed to shrink without anyone consciously deciding to go quiet, because even if they didn't know exactly what was happening, they could feel the shift in the air that comes when control starts to slip from the person who usually dictates the tone, and I stood there without moving. Not because I wanted to draw attention to myself, but because I knew that stepping back would give him the space to pretend it didn't matter, and I wasn't about to let him have that escape route this time, not when I had carried this proof for so long, waiting for the perfect moment when it would cut through the performance and force him to see what he had refused to see for years. He held it like he wasn't sure if he wanted to open it in front of everyone, and I could tell by the way his jaw moved that he was weighing his options. Because my father has always been a man who believes every problem can be handled privately if you just keep a steady voice and act as though the facts will eventually bend to your will. But there are some facts that don't bend no matter how much you wish they would. And in that instant, I think he knew, even before reading a single word, that this was one of those times. Mark tried to make a joke, something about light reading for Dad's birthday, but it landed flat, and instead of getting the usual chuckles, it hung in the air like a bad smell. My mother looked from me to my father with that tight expression she uses when she's bracing for something she can't stop, and my aunt, who has always loved a little drama as long as it's not about her, leaned slightly forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on the paper like she was trying to read it upside down. When he finally unfolded it, I could see his gaze move quickly at first, scanning for context, but then slowing down when he realized what he was holding wasn't a vague complaint or a petty family gripe. It was a meticulous, point-by-point breakdown of transactions, dates, and documented patterns of financial behavior that he could not explain away with charm or excuses. Every line was there because I had verified it 3 times over, and every attachment was the kind of evidence you can't simply call a misunderstanding. He stopped about halfway through, not because he was finished, but because the impact had already hit, and he knew exactly where the rest of it was going to lead. The table stayed frozen, forks suspended in midair, drinks untouched, because everyone in that room had been conditioned to take their cues from him, and right now he wasn't giving any. Mark shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something on his face other than smug confidence. It wasn't guilt exactly, more like the creeping awareness that his usual immunity might not hold this time, not here. Not with this many eyes on him, and not with that document in our father's hands. He tried to lean over to catch a glimpse of the page, but my father pulled it slightly closer to himself, and that tiny movement spoke louder than anything he could have said. I didn't gloat, I didn't explain, I didn't launch into a speech, because the truth was already doing all the work for me, and part of the power in that moment came from the fact that I wasn't begging anyone to listen. I was simply making it impossible for them to look away. The more my father read, the paler he became, and I could almost see the calculations running through his mind. Who else knows? How far has this gone? What will this look like if it gets outside these walls? And I knew then that I had chosen the perfect setting, because in his world, public perception is the currency that buys you everything else, and nothing rattles him more than the idea of a crack in the image he's built. He set the paper down without saying a word, took a slow sip from his glass, but didn't actually swallow, and then looked directly at Mark in a way I hadn't seen since we were teenagers and Mark had gotten caught lying about wrecking the car. The silence stretched long enough for my cousin at the far end of the table to finally clear his throat, but still my father didn't speak. My mother reached for his hand, but he pulled it back to straighten the paper as if aligning the edges could somehow give him back the control he'd just lost. When he finally did speak, his voice was lower than usual, the kind of tone he uses in business meetings when the outcome has already shifted, but he hasn't yet decided how to position himself in the new reality, and all he said was, "We'll discuss this later." But the damage was already done, because everyone there knew that later, in our family, never meant forgotten. It meant that something behind closed doors was about to happen, and it would not be gentle. I sat back down without waiting for permission, my heart steady not because I wasn't nervous, but because I knew I'd played this exactly right. I didn't need him to admit in front of everyone that I had been right all along. I just needed to plant the seed in every person at that table that the golden boy wasn't untouchable, that the daughter who had been overlooked for years had been paying attention. and that the story they'd all gotten so comfortable with might not survive the night. As dinner limped on, conversations turned stilted and fragmented, people forcing small talk that went nowhere, the kind you make when you're trying to distract yourself from the fact that you've just witnessed a shift in the family's unspoken hierarchy. My father didn't toast again, Mark didn't joke again, and I didn't need to say another word. The paper had already spoken for me, and now the next move was his, but for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how much power I had in deciding what happened next. After the plates were cleared and the pretend laughter died out, my father asked everyone to give us a minute, which in our family is code for this is going to be uncomfortable, and I don't want witnesses, and when the door closed and it was just the three of us, my father, Mark, and me, I could feel that old instinct to soften the blow kick in, the one that has me translating bad news into something palatable so men can keep their dignity, but I shut it down because that instinct is exactly what kept me sidelined for so long, so I sat, folded my hands, and told my father calmly that I wasn't there to ruin his night or humiliate his son. I was there to protect something he claims to value more than anything, which is the family's name and the business that carries it, and I said I had already done the work to make that possible if he was willing to listen rather than lecture. He tried the old lines first, the ones about loyalty and discretion and how family matters stay in the family, and I let him talk for a while because I needed him to feel the edge of his own words, and then I told him that what was on that page wasn't a family tiff. It was the kind of pattern that triggers bank covenants and insurance clauses and potentially some very official questions if we pretend it did not happen, and I said that I had spoken, hypothetically and without naming names, to our accountant and to the relationship manager at the bank, and that both had given me clear, documented guidance about what would need to happen if a company wanted to correct a mess like this before it turned into something worse. And that guidance included an immediate pause on the person responsible from touching accounts, an independent review by a third party, and a simple, non-negotiable control that I had already baked into our processes once and could expand tomorrow if he said yes. Dual authorization on all payments above a modest threshold, with a paper trail that would survive scrutiny from anyone who might care to ask. Mark exploded, as expected, with bluster and accusations about me being dramatic and jealous and power-hungry, and I let him burn himself out because there is nothing more useful than a man who cannot stop talking when the room requires silence. And when he finally ran out of breath, I turned to my father and said that I was not asking for an apology or a medal or even a confession. I was offering him a choice between a quiet, controlled fix that would be invisible to the outside world and a messy, public problem that would make vendors nervous, spook the bank, and lock us into years of explaining, and then I laid out the part one had not told anyone yet because leverage is only leverage if you use it carefully. I said I had drafted, with the accountant's help, a short resolution that did not remove Mark from the company forever but temporarily suspended his signing authority, shifted approvals to a shared process, and authorized an independent review that I would not control, and that I had already secured a letter from our largest vendor and a conditional email from the bank stating that if those steps were taken within 30 days, they would consider the matter closed with no escalation, but if not, the bank would be required by its own policies to freeze the line of credit until questions were resolved, which meant payroll would be at risk, and nothing, in my experience, focuses a patriarch's mind faster than the words payroll at risk. My father went quiet, the kind of quiet that usually comes before he decides to bulldoze the conversation, but then he picked up the phone, called the accountant on speaker, and asked in that slow, careful voice if what I had just described would satisfy the bank and clean the books without a scandal, and when the accountant confirmed, step by step, that this was the cleanest path and that waiting would only create bigger problems, I watched my father's shoulders drop in that very human way that men are not proud to show, and I felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief because the victory I had wanted for so long did not feel like triumph over a person. It felt like finally being allowed to stop pretending reality bends to a family narrative if you just love hard enough. He signed, not a grand signature on fancy paper, but a simple authorization memo that emailed the banker and the accountant and me in the same thread, confirming that effective immediately Mark would have no access to payments, that all invoices would route through the shared address I had set up months earlier, and that an outside firm would conduct a review with full cooperation. And when Mark lunged into a tantrum about betrayal and siblings and how I was killing the company, my father turned to him with a look I had not seen since we were kids and said, in a voice that made even me sit up straighter, that the only thing killing the company was entitlement without consequences, and if he wanted a future here, he would show up at 9 the next morning to hand over his laptop and answer questions like an adult who respects the people who keep this place alive. I won't lie and tell you it felt clean or pretty, because victory in real life is not a confetti moment. It is 1,000 small confirmations that you were not crazy, that your work mattered, and that someone finally had to face what you saw all along. And as I walked to my car, I opened an email I had prepared weeks earlier. Not a threat, not a bombshell, just a quiet set of instructions to the operations team outlining the new approval flow, the weekly transparency report I would send every Friday, and an optional resource list for anyone who needed clarity about the changes, and I hit send. And in that tiny motion, I felt the weight shift from proving myself to running the system I had built in the shadows, while everyone was busy praising the person who kept breaking it. In the days that followed, the review did exactly what I knew it would do, which was confirm the pattern without collapsing the entire house. The vendor sent a thank you note for clearing the backlog with penalties waived because respect had finally entered the conversation. The bank unfroze the hold they had quietly placed because the memo showed a living control, and my mother, who had spent years smoothing the surface while swallowing her own doubts, came into my office, closed the door, and told me that she was proud in a way she could not say out loud in the kitchen because habit is a hard jail to break, and I hugged her without making it a moment because she has her own story to unlearn and I was not going to rush it. The last thing I did, and this is the part one designed for myself more than anyone else, was schedule a meeting with my father for the following week, where I brought a short agenda with only 3 lines. An apology I was not required to accept, but he offered in his own sideways way, a new title that reflected the work I had already been doing, and a simple, signed commitment that all promotions and bonuses would tie to documented outcomes rather than proximity to his chair, and when he nodded and signed and did not try to wrap it in a speech about family, I realized the plan had landed exactly where it needed to, not with fanfare, not with revenge that leaves a crater, but with a firm reset that removed the cushions and put the weight where it belongs. I won't pretend that everything is perfect or that Mark found humility overnight, because people do not turn into saints when the paper trail catches up to them, but I will say this. The next time my father raised a glass in a room full of people, he did not perform a story about loyalty. He said a simple thank you to the people who kept the wheels on when they could have fallen off, and he looked at me without flinching, and it was enough, because the point was never to make him beg or to watch my brother crumble. The point was to end a script that kept me small, and to replace it with a system that made truth louder than charm, and if you are wondering whether that felt like too much, I can tell you that it felt like exactly enough, because for the first time in a very long time, I walked out of a family gathering knowing I had not just survived the scene, I had directed the ending, and it was finally mine.